I see old industrial sites being used to capture and store carbon, vaccines being manufactured, offshore wind turbines creating clean energy for the rest of the country, all located within a free port with a treasury just down the road and a UK infrastructure bank only an hour away. I see innovative, fast-growing businesses hiring local people into decent, well-paid green jobs. I see people designing, manufacturing and exporting incredible new products and services. I see people putting down roots in places they are proud to call home. I see a people optimistic and ambitious for their future. That, Madam Deputy Speaker, is the future economy of this country.
After 11 months in this job, it's nice finally to be standing opposite the person actually making decisions in this government. The trouble is, it's those decisions that have left us with the mess we find today. I'm sure this budget will look better on Instagram. In fact, this week's PR video cost the taxpayer so much I was half expecting to see a line in the OBR forecast for it.
Welcome to Labour Grassroots, and we've just had the budget today, so I thought we could have a look at a couple of the speakers in there. One was the Chancellor and one was Keir Starmer, obviously. To try and get our heads around it, I've invited Andrew Fisher, who was on Sunday's show. Are you there, Andrew?
I'm here, hello.
What do you see from, the Chancellor said he sees a lot of, he's got a vision and he can see all these things, but weren't lots of those things that he could see things that were kind of almost nicked from Labour, but not quite in the same way?
Well, he's stolen a lot of our rhetoric. If you've been listening to him this afternoon, you would have heard about a green industrial revolution, about a national infrastructure bank, even corporation tax rises, which we were talking about on Sunday. Nearly up to the level we called for. 26%, I think it was in the last manifesto, 25% we're going up to, allegedly, by 2023. The problem is, it's just not on the scale. They announced a 12 billion national infrastructure bank today, which includes money for green projects. We called for a 250 billion green transformation fund. If you look at what Joe Biden, who's by no means a socialist revolutionary, is doing in the US, then by relative scale to the US economy to ours, so allowing for that, Joe Biden's doing at least double the stimulus that has been put in this budget. So it's nowhere near on the scale, it's nowhere near on the substance, and actually beneath that, if you look at how it affects real people day to day in the immediate future, it's incredibly bad what he's done today. I mean, maybe we'll come on to that in a minute, but in terms of the bigger picture stuff, the OBR, which is the independent body which looks at the government's policies and then creates forecasts off the back of them, says our economy is going to be permanently 4% smaller because of the lack of ambition, effectively, that we're not going to make up. This is, the pandemic is going to have a permanent damaging effect on the UK economy, equivalent to 4% of GDP, 3 to 4% of GDP, depending on, which way it goes slightly. So, when you put that in the context, we've had the worst economic hit from coronavirus of any major economy. We've got the worst death rate from coronavirus of any major economy. We have failed economically, we failed socially, and hidden in this, there's stealth cuts to health and social care funding as well in this budget. So it's a really, really bad thing. And, I think all the lauding, Pravda-like, praise for Rishi Sunak on the BBC, we really need a counter to that, because this is very, very bad. This is the rhetoric of John McDonnell maybe, but it's the policies of Margaret Thatcher underneath.
I mean, it was very slick, wasn't it? The presentation and the whole way he made it look like it was all ordered and he covered everything, and it was sort of mesmerising. And they're quite clever at doing that, aren't they? And nicking some catchphrases from Labour, so it sounds like they're accommodating what we need. But then, looking at some of the tweets that you've put loads of tweets out since the budget. But this thing about the pay freeze on the income tax allowance threshold, the freeze on that, So if inflation goes up, then we're all paying more income tax, but they don't sort of spell that out. And also the rise in council tax he's not going to mention that in the budget, but so they're very clever at that kind of thing, aren't they? I mean, and it's hard to argue against it when it's kind of blinding. They kind of blind you with this stuff. So what do you think? What do you think about, for example, this point that Jeremy Corbyn made about furlough and the minimum wage?
Yeah, I mean, that's a point I've been making for a while. In fact, I wrote an article on that back in April 2020. So what's happened was, if you're furloughed, you get 80% of your pay, which is a little bit below what some other European countries did, but at the time, broadly welcomed by the TUC and others. But if you're on the minimum wage, I argued that there should be, and Jeremy Corbyn argued today, there should be 100% floor on that. So you shouldn't get 80% of the minimum, because the minimum is the minimum, right? It's the point at which we shouldn't drop below. So you should get 100% if you're on the minimum wage or just above it, up until the minimum wage, and then obviously 80% for people who could afford to take a slight hit. So that was, it's a fairly basic argument. That should definitely happen. It didn't happen. Furlough's been extended for 6 months, but actually, when you look at what's happening in July, companies are going to be asked to pay 10% of the wages. At that point, they're going to decide, actually, is this job coming back? And then in August, it goes up to 20%. And then a lot more companies are going to decide, is this job really going to come back? And what you're likely to see at that point is a spike in unemployment. Now, that was always going to happen because the economy changes. And in effect, we've put the entire labour market, or not the entire labour market, but currently 4.7 million workers on furlough in a sort of state of paralysis. And in that time, the economy changes, businesses collapse, all the rest of it, things change. And obviously, with a pandemic, things change dramatically. So there is a risk that we get higher unemployment. And what we should have seen today is the sort of job guarantee scheme that both Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister, the TUC, and to his credit, Johnny Reynolds on the Labour front bench have been calling for, that creates new jobs, skilled jobs, gives training opportunities. We didn't get anything on the scale of that today from Rishi Sunak. So what we're likely to see, and the OBR forecast, unemployment is going to go up to 6.5% by the middle of this year. And that's really worrying. That's an extra million people or so, I think, off the top of my head. I need to check that. But the reality is we're going to see a lot more people unemployed. And on top of that, even if you're in work, we've just talked about the pay freeze for public sector workers that hits in April. You're going to be hit with a council tax rise of 5% in April. The income tax threshold is being frozen, which means you'll pay a little bit more tax on the same salary. So again, you're getting another hit there. In 6 months' time, the universal credit uplift of £20 is going. So if you're on a low wage or unemployed, your income's going down £20 a week. It's not going to be extended to legacy benefits. There's hundreds of thousands of disabled people who'd never got this uplift in the first place, still won't be getting it. And there's nothing in the budget at all today to deal with all the rent debt. There is a huge, I think about 1 million renters and mortgage holders are behind on their housing costs. There's nothing to deal with that. How do you deal with that? There's a lot of renters who have racked up huge debts that are not going to be paid off. And the eviction ban ends at the end of this month. That wasn't extended either. So there's a housing crisis looming. People's incomes are going to be cut. There's no job creation scheme. There's no big, bang on that. People's incomes on unemployment benefit, universal credit, as it currently is going to go down in 6 months' time, just at the time that the furlough scheme ends and more people are put on unemployment benefit. Now, that is a terrible budget. There's no dressing that up with any amount of Instagram posts or flashy videos. It's terrible.
Right, and the councils are also not getting any more funding, are they? So people in need in local areas won't be given the support that they would need from the councils. And what you said also about the employers paying a bit more every month from, when was it?
July. July they start paying 10% of the wages.
I mean, that sounds like a disaster. But the question I'd like to ask you really is who's benefiting from this budget? If you had to say, because I don't really know the big earners and all the tax that they pay, but he was saying some stuff about giveaways, and I'm suspecting that some of his mates are getting money out of this. Can you pinpoint anyone in particular who's benefiting?
Well, overall, if you look at the the budget for the people at the top end, I mean, there's been no increase in the higher rates of income tax. So the people who have done very well and either were in very high paid jobs already or have gone up, you know, as we've seen, there's no increase in sort of tax of dividends. What, you know, we called for, John McDonnell's written on this as well, about a windfall tax on the pandemic profiteers. So lots of companies and individuals have done very well out of this pandemic. You know, if you think of not just the people who've got Matt Hancock's phone number and have got dodgy contracts off of him, but if you think of it more substantially, the banks, because of the stamp duty cut, there's been more lending on mortgages. So the banks have made more profits. Landlord companies have made bigger profits. You know, there's been a big rise in the number of corporate landlords as well as a result of this. I think an extra 20,000 landlord companies were established in the last year. So all of those things, streaming services, delivery companies, you know, the fact that we've shifted our retail onto online rather than off the high street has shifted who we buy from, and capturing some of that profit would have been a good thing. So they've all been let off. So that's a huge pile of who could have been targeted. And the corporation tax rise, although I welcome it, you know, going up to 25%, it's still the lowest in the G7, so lower than you know, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the US, and Canada. There's the other one. It's also been offset by lots of tax reliefs and allowances that will actually undermine the impact of that in terms of bringing in revenue. So I think in total, over the next 5 years or so from when it comes in, it's due to bring in about an extra 47 billion in revenue. But on their forecast, it will give back 25 billion of that, so just over half, in allowances and relief. So in a sense, it looks like always jacking up corporation tax to levels, you know, still lower than they were when Labour was last in, by the way, in 2010. So it looks like he's putting it back up and reversing some of the Osborne things, but in a sense, he's only half doing that.
Well, I mean, I'm going to move on to other people in a bit, but I just wanted to ask you finally what you thought about Labour's strategy coming into the budget. Have they made it really difficult for arguments about, for example, the pay freeze, because we're talking about corporation tax and
we talked about this on Sunday, didn't we? And look, I think they got it wrong on picking this fight over corporation tax. And you know, Rishi Sunak was never going to bring in an immediate rise in corporation tax. He was never going to do that. And to make that the point of contest over this was a mistake. Actually, I thought today in responding to the budget, I thought Keir Starmer said, "Where's the funding for council house building? Where's the National Care Service? Where's the real funding for a Green New Deal?" You know, those sort of things were right. And I thought he actually did quite well in response in that speech. But yeah, the whole run up to it hasn't been focused on the council tax rise, on the public sector pay freeze, on the universal credit uplift being made permanent and extended to people on legacy benefits. You know, hundreds of thousands of disabled people on ESA. Those are the things it should have been focused on. So the run up, you know, we know they got wrong, but actually today they seem to have focused on the right things, which I think is probably a reflection of the pressure that's been put on them, the backlash that they've seen. And I think we should, you know, I think we have to accept our victories here a bit. You know, they actually pointed out some good things. And the other thing actually Keir Starmer mentioned today, which I thought was good, and I will give him credit for this, is statutory sick pay. Because very soon, from next week, we're going to start unlocking kids going back. That's 10 million people mixing in classrooms and teachers and so on. And statutory sick pay still isn't enough to survive on. It's £95 a week. And what you've got is, you will see the government's own modelling shows that there'll be an increase in infections from next week. Not, you know, a massive spike, but an increase. That's going to put pressure on the NHS and GPs. And people aren't going to self-isolate if they can't afford to. And we still haven't solved this basic thing of statutory sick pay, which is the lowest in Europe, 29% of your salary on average. In Germany, it's 100% of your salary if you're on sick pay. You know, we should have basic contractual rights to sick pay for all workers from day one, like any civilized country would, and we still haven't got that. So that was a good thing they mentioned as well. But and again, another thing that Rishi Sunak just didn't. So in effect, the real problem with Rishi Sunak's budget was what wasn't in it, really, rather than what was.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming on. Great. You're very productive on your tweets. It's really good to read them. Thank you.
Cheers.
And I'm going to move on to speak to people who are facing difficulties with the situation they're living in, and ask them how they feel about the budget and also how they're getting on generally. the first person I'd like to speak to is Elaine. Are you there, Elaine?
Hi. Evening.
Good evening. Now, I sent out a survey and you replied it to the survey, and you were very honest about what your situation is. That you were a successful manager, and now you're actually living. You have to use food banks to get by, and you're a single parent. Can you tell us how you feel about your situation, and do you feel hopeful or worse about what this budget's doing, and what do you think Labour should be doing at the moment?
Okay, thank you. So yeah, I mean, I found myself unemployed a little while before the pandemic, and I'd actually been doing voluntary work anyway. The pandemic came along and I was in the process of looking for full-time employment. I work in the charity sector. Primarily, I've worked for the NHS and places like that as well. So I've got a fair bit of experience under my belt. I've worked since the age of 15, you know, and the pandemic came along and found myself dependent on universal credit, which doesn't cover my bills because I live in an area of London that has really high I have really high costs. I live in a Section 106 property, so it's not actually affordable. The bills, the rents are high. So quite early on, myself and my daughters, my oldest daughter had been furloughed and my youngest is still in education, found ourselves basically without basics. When I say basics, I mean food, items that are non-perishable, fruit and veg, stuff that we actually need, you know, and in a bit of a pickle, to be honest with you. So luckily I managed to get onto a waiting list for a local food cycle COVID-19 response group that had been set up in my area, and then came along to receive the food donations. Now, this is a really unusual thing for me because even though I've been single parent for over 2 decades, I've always worked and supported myself. And I've always been the person that helped other people. So in the past, I actually set up an NHS, a food bank within the NHS for patients on discharge. So we know that a lot of elderly patients, when they leave hospital, basically go home to no food in their cupboards. So I saw a need and set up a food bank. I've worked with food banks with interfaith Jewish and Muslim charities and organizations. And that feels good. And that's my natural default, helping other people when I can. So now I found myself in a position relying on charity. The early part of the lockdown, which was the early spring last year, I mean, what was really good about it was nice to meet people locally and see them all gather together in a kind of one cohesive kind of mission to help others. And that felt great. But it also dawned on me that I had some quite elderly people delivering food to my doorstep every Saturday, and that felt really uncomfortable. I went to pick up the food one day when the service changed over to a local community centre, and I asked if I could volunteer because it's not, there's no pride in poverty. I cannot state that enough. I come from a poor background in Liverpool originally, working class background. I've done my best, but there's absolutely no pride in poverty whatsoever or being dependent on charity. There's a lot of stigma attached to being dependent on charity and welfare as it is. And we've seen the last few days, Sean Bailey is a perfect example of kind of demoralising, demonising people with it in regards to his universal basic income. So I'm now a volunteer at that particular food bank. I'm still receiving food. That means that basically me and my children have always got fresh fruit and veg, things like UHT milk, these basics as well. When it was really cold a few months ago, my electric, I've got one of the big 6 companies. It was extortionate, £50 a week. So really at that point, you know, it was eating or heating. It really was. Being able to volunteer at the food bank has been quite transformative for me because, I mean, I've looked at studies today in Vermont University that look at how people feel about receiving charity. And I think it's something that we should, because I can tell you now that many people I know over the years won't receive charity because they have pride. Working class people have pride. Most of us go to work, and we've always gone to work. I mean, I've applied for hundreds and hundreds of jobs over the last year, so that's really demoralising when you don't hear a single thing from most of them. I have a break for a few weeks, you know, sulk, then, you know, pick myself up and start again. Last year, I lost my one of my older sisters to COVID. And I think one of the worst things about it was I couldn't actually afford to go home to her funeral because all the domestic coach services that I would have normally been able to afford had stopped their service. And so it was only the one train service that has the monopoly from Liverpool to London. So I actually couldn't afford it. It was quite short notice, the funeral. I wasn't expecting she died. She's in her mid-50s. She shouldn't have died from COVID. And I couldn't go. So saying that, I want to wrap up and not end on such a downer. You know, my eldest daughter, she works in private members cocktail bar. She's on furlough at the moment. She's lost more than 20% of her wage because actually a huge part of her wage, because it's a low wage, was actually tips from the bar. So she's took a huge hit in terms of her wages as well. But I really also think, Crispin and everybody else, that I'm also quite fortunate. I'm not one of these people that the NHS right now, that what Rishi Sunak's budget has done is has pissed all over the public sector workers that basically have probably ended up with PTSDs and traumas. And for these people should be getting a hazard pay. And for them to take, actually in reality, in a cut in their pay. I'm a former NHS employee. I cannot see what these people have in terms of hope. You expect them to go on and put their lives at risk, put their loved ones' lives at risk. And this budget gives them nothing. I just wanted to say quickly on Keir Starmer's Labour. Again, I don't think the way Keir's going at the moment would have been much better. In fact, it looks in terms like things like corporation tax, Labour would have come out a lot worse for this. And one thing I would recommend Labour do is stop pretending that it's just been the last 10 years. Yes, austerity has compounded matters, but Labour, Tony Blair's new Labour, need to take responsibility for the harm they caused for many, many decades, and for the people that did not become middle class. I'm not middle class now. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. Thank you very much. Now I'm going to move on to Mukesh. Are you there?
You need to unmute.
I spoke to you in the summer, and you were helping with a food bank there that I noticed when I was driving along in Hounslow. There's a massive queue of people around the corner. How do you see the situation in Hounslow where you are with the food poverty? Is it worse than it was then? Is there more demand for the food bank?
Well, if I link it to the budget as well, I think it's going to get probably worse because there's very little being mentioned in terms of social care and support for the community. The food banks rely on donations, and if fewer and fewer people are able to donate, that means the pop-up food banks will close down. The churches, which might be the faith groups, which do run many of the food banks, if their members are asking for help and there isn't any, it's a really tough problem. So I think there's going to be an ongoing, if not worsening, issue with food poverty. And maybe you've heard this expression of heat or eat. And if we, if this thing extends on through the summer, and things don't improve, it could be a really serious problem that people are going to be going into more debt, the need for borrowing money, people being kicked out. Local authorities are not going to get any more money. We've already been told that. So I think the food bank scenario is that it's the food banks are desperate. I had a message today asking me, could I arrange to get simple things like salt and sugar? Yeah, we already know that they want soap and hand wash and things like that. But then to get a request saying, can you please see if you can arrange to find someone kind enough to donate, 24 packets of salt, because people are having to, cook, and you can't cook unless there's a little bit of salt and spice. And then sugar is really important as well. I know people say it's not that important, but I can tell you when you don't have it, it really does make a difference. Just try going out. When you were a kid, and most of us probably had Mars bars, and we put them in the fridge. We had cold milk, and we sliced the Mars bars. that's a luxury for many families at the moment. So I hope that kind of it's not a rosy picture, but I do think that you've got a scenario where it's going to be hard. The queues are getting bigger, and when I talk to the various food banks who I link up with, what they're finding is that even if corporates are donating surplus food, it's not as much as it was earlier on, because they are managing their food purchasing better, so they have less to give away. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Right. So it's just diminishing all the time.
And it's going to get worse. And if the local authorities don't have the money, then the situation with the food banks is that, and this came up at the interfaith event the other day, that people said from the faith groups, they said, you always ask us to help out in the community. We pull all the stops out, but you don't even give us any discount on things like electricity, on rates, things like that, which make our life easier, so we can maintain at least the building. Simple things like that could make a huge difference to community centres and so on. And regardless of what Rishi has said, that he's going to have these, I think, 400 million to give to communities to go and buy their local pub. It's great if you're living perhaps out in the countryside and you've got the traditional post office, one pub, the village store. That's about it. And they want to keep the pub. But if you're in a city or a metropolitan area, can you see that happening? No, I don't think so.
Right.
That's all. I think I've contributed enough.
No, it's good to hear. I mean, it's not good to hear, but it's good to be updated on what's happening, so we know what's going on instead of thinking Rishi's got it covered.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Our trade union that which I'm part of, which is Unite, what they did this Christmas was that they contributed a certain amount of money, which they would have given elsewhere, and they asked us to kind of find a food bank to give to, and they donated money to that. So I think lots of trade unions and labour groups did that. So.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you, Mukesh.
I'm going to leave you now.
Cheers. Now I'm going to move quickly to Kate in Brighton. Kate,
hiya.
Can you tell us what's going on? You're running a kind of food bank, but it isn't a food bank. Can you?
Yeah, that's right. So I was a Labour councillor. I'm now an independent councillor because I fell victim to the witch hunt. So there's two really important things I wanted to say. The first thing was to Elaine, is that you're so right, the thing about pride. And I started off volunteering, delivering food parcels to people that were isolated or that were vulnerable. And it quickly became apparent that once that stopped, we had nothing to offer them. So we did a canvass of people locally, and we said, if we charged a small amount, but instead of you being given the food, you can come along and you can shop for what you can choose what you want. And that's really what people wanted. So we set up a social supermarket. We were the first one in Brighton. We're in the estate called Molescombe, which is in the top 10% of the most deprived areas in the country. People think of Brighton as being very, very affluent, but there's two sides to Brighton. There's a lot of poverty all around the outskirts. So people pay £1 a week to join, and then they pay £3.50 each week, and they get a shopping basket with our logo on it, and they shop through the hall, a one-way system. And we colour code items, so we put the more expensive kind of luxury items, or maybe the slightly unhealthier items. They get 4 of those, and then they get 10 green items, which is all the fresh fruit and veg, all the cupboard staples. Nobody pays for sanitary ware or dog food or cat food, because we know that people feed their animals rather than feed themselves. So that has all worked really, really well. It's about having dignity. It's not everybody that comes to us is destitute. A lot of the people there are just really, they need a top up. They're working poor. So we have a great relationship with the local supermarket and with Fair Share. So we're quite lucky. We've got quite a lot of stock, so people get a lot of choice. And what I would say is it's very, very interesting and it's a class issue about what working class people want to eat and what middle class people who can afford to eat whatever they want think that working class people should be eating. So I would say that the bulk of people in Hove think that the people in Moulscombe should be eating chickpeas and porridge because it's good for you, it's cheap and it's nutritious. But of course, I eat chickpeas and porridge, but I choose to eat that. I don't have to eat that. So we really go with what we think people would like to eat. So UHT milk isn't very palatable to children, so we always give out instant whip. So that way at least you get the calcium down their neck. And at Christmas we spent a great deal of money buying people meat. And we've got some food banks in Brighton that are vegetarian, which it drives me nuts. So we bought people what they wanted to have. We bought them mince, we bought them chicken, we bought them, it cost us a bloody fortune. But people couldn't believe that they had fresh meat. People get so used to Fray Bentos pies and corned beef and tuna till it comes out of your ears. So to have fresh meat was a real big thing. The other thing that I wanted to say was today I got 300 quid from Unison because I spoke at their AGM. And they would normally buy food for the people there. They would normally do catering. So instead of doing that, they gave the donations to the food bank. So if anybody wants to do a social supermarket, I think it's not ideal, but it's a route out of charity and food banks. It's got a bit of dignity and a bit of choice to it. But the other really good thing is we can use the money that we get to buy in things that we're short of. I love the thing about... people say, oh, cook yourself a nice vegetable soup. But if you haven't got vegetable stock cubes, if you haven't got tomato puree, if you haven't got herbs, if you haven't got salt, it's a bit of a bland old soup, that is. And that's the sort of thing that we now buy in, stuff like that. Tomato puree just flies out, stuff we take for granted. But we've also got, sorry, I'm going quick, I'll finish in a minute. But we've built up relationships with local suppliers. So we now buy in bulk fruit and veg every week from Sussex growers, and it's probably about the same price as Aldi, but it's loads better quality, and we have organic free range eggs, and so we're starting to build a way of the community feeding itself by buying itself what it wants at a price that's reasonable and that keeps local people in work. So I'm happy to help anybody set up a social supermarket. Don't be afraid, it's really good. It works well.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Kate.
you.
And please get in touch with Kate on the chat because we'll carry on talking after the show at 8:30 if people want to raise any points. We're going to move on to Dave in Liverpool. Dave is from Fans Supporting Food Banks and is also part of the Right to Food campaign. Are you there, Dave?
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. I was delighted with the comment Kate just made about vegans driving her nuts. She wants a copy like that. Thanks very much for the invitation to speak tonight about Fans Supporting Food Banks and the Right to Food campaign. And just to supplement what Kate's just been saying, and you're absolutely dead right, and it's something Fans Supporting Food Banks have attempted to do over the last 6 months, to actually move away from food banks and the need for food banks. And we've actually got a mobile pantry now that goes out into various areas of Liverpool. And we talk about living in a big municipal city. However, there's lots of areas in Liverpool which are food deserts, that they don't actually have supermarkets close by. They don't have a wide selection of food. So our pantry served over 130 people today, which times 4 because of the family. It's a considerable amount of people were fed today with fresh food, veg, meat and essentials. And that's clearly the way forward. One of the things I'm concerned about, there's a couple of people spoke about it this evening, and they spoke about charity. and I'm not too sure what the word charity means or what it's all about. I'm much more likely to use the word solidarity, because if you look back in the 80s, when we set up a minor support group in Liverpool, it wasn't looked upon as charity, it was looked upon as solidarity. And we need to move away from the mindset of food banks and people donating to food banks are providing charity, or they're giving the Tories the ideal opportunity to step away from their obligations. Quite clearly, working class communities step up to the plate in times of crisis, in times of need, and that's exactly what we're doing. We're showing solidarity with our communities, with our next door neighbours, with our people in the next street or the next town or the next city. We need to move away from that charity and nail that myth once and for all. It's working class solidarity, no more, no less. With regards to the Rights to Food campaign, which is just as important as 5 years ago when Transport and Food Banks first kicked off, we realised that standing outside Anfield and Goodison on a match day and collecting food would never eradicate food poverty in the UK. The sixth richest nation that had people going hungry on the streets. We were never going to do that, and the intention was never to do that. The intention was to put that stick and plaster on the gaping wounds. However, just as importantly, food poverty is created by politicians. Food insecurity is created by politicians, and we needed to make sure that the most vulnerable people in our communities and in society, the people who are heavily reliant on food banks and our solidarity, actually had a voice. And I think that's something that we're immensely proud of. And as the mover of the Right to Food petition, I'm extremely proud of the fact that that's currently got 45,000 signatures on it. And I'm convinced before we get to June that we'll have the 100,000 signatures that we need to secure a debate in Parliament. We need that debate in Parliament. Interestingly enough, because we're now on 45,000, I got a real flowery email of the government this morning to give the written response, because we'd gone through 10,000 signatures on the petition, and I didn't get past the first two sentences because it was a complete and utter waste of time. It didn't say, it didn't talk about the issues or discuss or debate any of the concerns that we've raised. I think the great British public needs to actually wake up and realise what's going on in and around them.
Yeah.
We've got a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity here. We missed the last once-in-a-lifetime opportunity when Jeremy Corbyn was railroaded out of the Labour Party and treated in such a disgraceful manner. We've got another opportunity here, which is a once-in-a-lifetime. Wow. People are quite shocked when you start talking about who and what the right to food actually is. When you actually tell people that 70 years ago, after the end of the last war, and I won't call it like they call it, a great war, because it wasn't a great war. There is no great wars anywhere, right? At the end of the last war, the British government signed a United Nations declaration to give its citizens the right to food. So they signed it 70 years ago. Unfortunately, it's not worth the paper it's written on, because it hasn't been enshrined in law. And that's why we need them 100,000 signatures. And I would urge every single one of you who's on here tonight to follow the lead. And just before I came on this evening, I'm pleased to report to tonight's meeting that Rotherham have just become a right to food local authority. Brighton will be within the next week or so. They've agreed tonight at a meeting. Now, when you look at the enormity...
Sorry, Dave, I'm a bit aware of the time. We've got quite a few other people coming in. I don't want to cut you short. I could listen to you for a long time. Would you be able to stay till after 8:30?
Absolutely, absolutely, no problem at all.
We'll speak a bit more then, because I've just got so many people I wanted to bring in, and I'm not very tough. Kerry, are you there?
Yep, I'm here.
Kerry, you're part of fans supporting food banks and Right to Food as well, and you're in Birmingham. So what's the situation in Birmingham?
Yeah, I am. So, yeah, I've been with Fans Supporting Food Banks Network now for around 4 years. And like I say, I'm based here in Birmingham. You know, in Birmingham, we're struggling, but the whole country is struggling. We know that. I actually, as part of my role as a trustee for a food bank, you know, we're operating some weeks at 200% what we were operating on this time last year. I'm also part of the Food Justice Network here in the city. So that is, you know, great initiatives, a bit like Kate was just talking on. You know, we've got community cafes, projects, pantries across the city. But what you will find is it's the community that are rallying and kind of doing the work. You know, we're the people kind of on the ground that are getting food to the people who need it. And a bit like Elaine, you know, there's hundreds, there's thousands of stories touching on various different faces of food poverty across the country. And there's not one stereotypical user. There's not, you know, one person that would walk into a food bank that need help. It really could happen to anyone, anywhere, and that's why we really need systemic change, you know, to ensure there's safety nets there for people that are reaching that level of crisis. I think one thing the pandemic has done is just shown the fragility of the system, how many people are so quickly plunged into dire straits that perhaps weren't even aware of, you know, food banks or the level of deprivation across the country, perhaps before the pandemic. For me, it's become even more kind of clear that social structure, the social security structure across the country was evidently inadequate much before the pandemic. You know, poverty is rife in every form. As we know, and as someone else touched on earlier, you know, if someone's hungry, they say, oh, well, have you been to the food bank? You know, that shouldn't be the answer. Like, that's not the permanent solution here. And something that I just wanted to touch on, particularly from the budget today, is that what really irks me about the government is that they expect us to trust them with money, but they can't trust people with money themselves. They don't trust the poor to have money. They don't trust us, or, you know, people who are coming to the food bank, they don't trust them to go out to a shop and to purchase whatever they want to buy for their weekly food supply. They expect them, like, I think maybe it was Kate that said, yeah, to have chickpeas, to have porridge, kidney beans. You know, we're trying to come up with things in the last few months, like kettle recipes, people who are in temporary accommodation, like, what can I make with the kettle that I've got in my hostel room? They don't trust people enough to have the dignity that they deserve to go out and purchase their own weekly shop. And that is really the crux that irritates me the most. And when it comes to the Right to Food campaign, I mean, I'm fully on board with everything in principle of the right to food. But what I would like to see is, you know, dignity being retained and freedom of choice for people. If the government can do whatever they like with the money that they've got, then people should have that respect and that dignity themselves. I don't want to talk for too long. I know you've got a lot on tonight, but that's my main point that I just wanted to bring across.
Thank you. I'm trying to get to 8:30 and get as many in, but thank you, Kerry. Now I'm going to move on to Jennifer in Sheffield. Jennifer, your situation is you're disabled and you're a mother as well.
Yeah, so I'm a disabled claimant of ESA and also a parent of a disabled child. And so just making a little comment on the lack of any support for people who are legacy benefits, which some people have already spoken, have touched on after the budget announcements today. I am an activist with Disabled People Against Cuts, which some of you might have heard of, DPAC. So, you know, we had, obviously, I mean, the £20 a week uplift being kept for 6 months is a small positive for everybody that's going to be receiving it for the next 6 months. But we all know there's a heck of a lot wrong with universal credit. And we all know that once it gets to the end of that 6 months, then, as many people are saying today, charities, organisations and political groups alike, you know, this is going to leave people on cliff edge in 6 months' time, isn't it? So it's a stopgap. But for those of us on legacy benefits, which means ESA, JSA and income support, there's been no additional support since the pandemic began. And I think that there's a real lack of awareness of that. I mean, there was one journalist I was talking to earlier in the week from Calendar News. I don't know if everybody gets Calendar News. It's our regional one in Yorkshire, the Calendar News, ITV News. The journalist got in touch with Deepak Sheffield to see can I speak to someone on universal credit about the budget announcement? And I said, well, actually, the majority of our members aren't on universal credit, they're on the legacy benefits, and none of us have had any additional support. Oh, really? She says, I wasn't aware of that. I said, well, you actually in Sheffield, there's more people who are on legacy benefits, 24,500 people, than there are on universal credit, which is 23,000 people. So if you're looking at Sheffield alone, it must be a heck of a lot of people nationally who haven't had any support at all. So we started looking a bit more into this, and there's a great Twitter page you can look at called Frank Zola, Z-O-L-A, and they've actually released a breakdown of all the different figures of the different benefits added together. It's like 2.5 million people have had no additional support at all since the start of this pandemic.
Wow.
Myself and the other DPEC members and other activists, I'm sure, do not begrudge the additional support that's been given to people on universal credit, okay? Put that to one side. What about us? Because when the pandemic started, people like me who are used to accessing groceries and things like that online and always had a regular slot and things like that, we were dropped. We weren't Tesco's best customer or Sainsbury's best customer anymore. You know, we kind of got these like measly mouthed emails of like an apologetic, sweaty handshake given in digital form from the CEOs of these big supermarket chains saying, oh, we know you usually get your groceries with us, but guess what? Now loads of people with more money who are going to be using our facilities, you're not having your regular slot anymore, or words to that effect. So there was this big rush on the online deliveries, which meant people like me then, who would usually use things online, had to either go without, or, as people have mentioned previously as well, contact local food banks. So in my case, it was a local church group, helped 1 week. And I was really, really making things stretch, you know, really making things stretch, more than I should, more than any of us should. And another week, there's a FAMA COVID-19 group. They've called that name, actually, I think, on their Sheffield Facebook page, FAMA COVID-19 Action Group, I believe they're called. And they were incredibly supportive as well to anybody from all across the community, just to get delivering basics and stuff like that. But the other thing, Crispin, is like that you've got to look at travel for disabled people. So those are those that were shielding or sent shielding letters. We can't then be going and getting the bus if we have to access our clinics, if our clinics have still been running during the pandemic, which many of them haven't. Many of them have gone to online or been put on hold. We're forced to then get taxis, or we can't access our consultants' appointments and things like that as well. But the final thing I want to say is that the gas and electricity companies made this big thing, didn't they? Or the big six, as someone mentioned, made this big thing of saying, oh yeah, we're going to put like 40 quid on emergency credit now. So don't worry, if you get the virus or you test positive and you have to isolate, just put your card in your meter, you've got 40 quid emergency credit. Do you know how much was on mine today when my gas ran out? 6 quid. Because they've put it back to pre-pandemic amount on your emergency credit, very sneakily, all done under the radar. No one cares, no one's even noticed, because it's just small portion of society that are affected. I know you folks care, you know that, but people in general don't, and it hurts and it's hard.
I mean, I think we're getting a picture that this isn't really, we're not really covered. They're not covered for people. And you say 2.5 million beyond legacy payments. I just want to move on to Catherine, who's been sorry, I'm losing my thread now.
Crispy, can I really quickly say, sorry, so quickly, there was like 6 Labour MPs did send messages on their Twitter saying that they supported the £20 increase to people on legacy benefits. And you can see those on the DPAC and DPAC Sheffield Twitter pages.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to speak to Catherine. Are you there? You're
Yep.
on.
Yep, I'm here. Thanks,
You are
Crispin.
the co-chair of Disability Labour.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that people have been talking, Jennifer, with the stuff about disability. The stories that I hear. I'm also chair of a local coalition of disabled people as well, and there's the issues of kids going back to school. Now, if you have a parent that's sheltering or shielding, and you have a child going to school, you're terrified that they're going back and they're going to bring something back with them after being in classes. I don't care how much you test, that causes a disabled parent to be afraid of what's going to come in, even if they're being really good with shielding. The other thing that people won't talk about is then if you don't take the kid, if you don't let your kid go to school, then the school system will fine you for keeping them out illegally. So you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. The other thing is, and this is one of the things that people haven't talked about, is that many people who have disabled people who have been going through the shielding and that kind of thing, not all of them were on the extremely vulnerable list. So they were having to shield and rely on everybody else to deliver stuff to them. The other thing is there's been no mention of any money going into mental health services. And that in itself is going to cause a huge problem because there's going to be a tsunami of people who have had mental health problems that they haven't before. And they will end up falling into the category of being disabled via a long-term mental health condition. There's also the people who have been affected by COVID. We have no idea how to quantify how many people will be affected by long COVID who will also be part of the disabled community. And there has been nothing through Labour, and there's been nothing through the government to support us. And we're feeling like the forgotten ones. We can't help ourselves because we can't get a job. We can't be self-employed because we don't fall within the criteria. And if you're terrified to go out because you're afraid of getting ill, it's just going to play havoc with your mental health. And I think we have to force people to take some kind of action.
Well, thank you. Sorry to cut you short at all, but I'm aware that I'm well over time, and I appreciate everyone who's come on. We've still got people who want to speak about the monetary theory of the budget, and I'd like to have them speaking a bit later on if they can hang around a bit longer. I can see you, Mervyn, there for a start. And we're going to just kind of round off the show by talking to people who are experiencing difficulties with what's happening, and hear how they think the budget will affect them, if it will make any change at all. Jeanette, you're you wrote in to say you're a pensioner, and how does this affect pensions?
I'm trying to support people I know who are having financial difficulties, Crispin. Can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yes, I'm trying to support people. I do it quietly. I do it on my own. So I can't say I belong to DPAC, I'm a member of DPAC, and I'm a member of Unite Community. So I try to help out through those two organisations. I'm very pleased that they are in existence. They're very aware people, and they've been fighting a long time, especially DPAC. And I won't say too much about who it is. I'm just going to say I've got a sister who has been denied access to her state pension, which she's been working all her life for, because they changed the pension rules. And from time to time, I've really had to help her out of my limited state pension. And most people don't realise it's 7,000 per annum is the state pension of the United Kingdom. And it's the lowest in the whole of Europe, I understand. And that only goes so far. That's what I just wanted to say. I'm almost moved to tears tonight by the speakers we've had, and solidarity to absolutely everyone. And it's lovely to be able to come together, and if we can all learn from each other how to help, how to approach MPs, get the system changed. It has got to change. It's like putting a plaster over a wound without cleaning the wounds out so that the infection can heal. And if we don't do that, Crispin, the country is going to be in dire straits for a very long time to come. And I don't like seeing the country I've been living in like this. It deeply, deeply saddens me. So I'll keep it really short now, and perhaps one day we can all speak together again.
Well, we'll all speak together every week, twice a week. We're on here, and we'll keep listening to people like you, and we've got lots of strength in solidarity. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for inviting me.
Joanne, you're employed in the private sector. How do you see this affecting workers?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's already kicked off. Thanks, Christine, by the way. Yeah, I'm a London bus worker, and, you know, we've already started seeing things. You know, you probably have been aware that we've lost over 55 people nationwide to COVID. You know, and they kept telling us how wonderful. We got hundreds off sick, by the way, and plenty suffering with long COVID. And they started telling us how wonderful we were, you know, frontline workers, all this, that, you know, and immediately started cutting on pay by bringing in fire and rehire contracts, you know, which is driving down people's wages. Some bus drivers losing up to £2,500 a year from their wages. When I was listening to this budget today, what sprung out to me, and it's absolutely disgusting, is there was nothing really on public sector pay, which bounces on to private sector pay, because if they're not paying, this lot don't feel the need to either. Frontline workers, insecure 0 hours contracts, none of that was mentioned. The NHS, nothing. Care homes, mental health, nothing. Nothing to tackle unemployment, which is now running at 5%. It just goes on and on and on. And all you hear is this wonderful, aren't we doing well stuff from Rishi Sunak. And one thing I would like to add before I finish, because I'll keep it short, I know you're running out of time, but when you spoke about corporation tax going up to 25% earlier, but not until 2023, now if you consider they're already raking in huge profits, Amazon, you know, all the online shopping companies raking in absolute billions, and they're not starting the corporation tax till 2023. Now, one thing that nobody mentioned was just after he mentioned that, he said that he'd reduce their tax bills enormously and have the biggest business tax cut in 50 years. So he's gonna give it back to him, take it from him in one hand and give it straight back in the other. So I don't think we're going to benefit hardly anything out of this, and it makes me sick. And more of this fire and rehire is going on to drive down people's terms and conditions and wages. And we've got a hell of a fight on our hands, and we've got to fight that with everything we've got. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. Now, to round off this part of the show, I thought I would bring in Howard, who normally is able to rally the troops. Are you? How do you feel after hearing what you've heard from all those people who are struggling already? And it doesn't look like this budget's going to really repair the damage that's already been done. So, what can we do? And what's Labour doing? What's Labour doing?
Indeed, Crispin. Well, no, it's very difficult to hear people's own personal narratives and the struggles that they're going through. There's so many comrades in this call, so many wonderful people. It's difficult to pick out people, but I'm going to say that Dave Kelly and Kerry, the work that they're doing is absolutely extraordinary and should be supported by everyone. And, we're in 45,000 signatures and there's 6 million people in the trade union movement. We should be in 6 million signatures. The idea that we have to campaign for the right to food in society is just quite disgusting. But Crispin, I'm going to start by disagreeing with Andrew Fisher in respect of Keir Starmer today. Keir Starmer was pathetic today, and there's no two ways about it. What we had in respect of this today was an establishment economist up against an establishment lawyer, and nobody spoke for workers at all. And today was unfortunately the long end of a road for Labour in respect of its failure to give any vision to working class people or any alternative in society. And let's deal with some statistics here, Crispin, because I think they do matter. We have 14 million people in poverty. That's not me saying that, that's a UN report. We have 10 million people who use food banks. We have 4 million children living in poverty throughout their childhood and 2.5 million children who are using food banks. I've said this statistic before and I'll keep on saying it because it matters. Since the 2008 financial crash, £538 billion, £500 billion has moved to 1,000 wealthiest people in our nations, at the same time as workers have lost £453 billion in real terms. In the last 4 months, Crispin, those companies that are in the stock exchange that are valued at over £1 billion have seen their wealth increase by £600 billion in the last 4 months. UK billionaires this year added £33 billion to their wealth in 2020. And the reason why we have to put that context to this is because at the end of this crisis is the moment to talk about society change, to give a vision of something that is different than what we've put up for a decade and more of neoliberal policies, to have a Labour leader who has the empathy and the vision and the compassion to step forward and talk for people. This budget today, and it gives some more stats to it, there is an £8 billion stealth tax there. By the thresholds of income tax not going up, there will be an extra 1.3 million people who will pay income tax at the lowest rate as a consequence of it. The £20 on universal credit is temporary. There is a £2 billion COVID tax bill, council tax bill, as a consequence of this. We've heard nothing about the public sector, nothing about social care. As Joanne said, we've heard nothing about fire and rehire. We have no minimum wage threshold for the furlough. Hospitality workers who I look after in Unite, who don't get the minimum wage now whenever they're furloughed, don't get their tips, are supposed to pay the bills on 50% of their wages. It is simply impossible. And we know that we're about to go into an epidemic of people being evicted from their properties whenever the eviction ban comes to an end because of the increase of debt. Yet where is a Labour leader? Where is the opposition? Where is the vision that is coming through? We should have had a Labour leader today who talked about society change, who wanted to say very proudly that he's for wealth taxes and windfall taxes, not simply to pay for this crisis, but because he wants to change society to a fairer and more equal society. We should have had a Labour leader who said very clearly today that the privatisation of the NHS has to stop. We should have had a Labour leader that said that the bare minimum that those who work in social care need and deserve is to be under the auspices of the NHS and not to the vagaries of private owners. We should have a Labour leader who's not talking about £8.69 for a social care worker going to £10. Let's see some ambition here. Let's have a minimum wage of £15 in society. Let's have a Labour leader who wants to talk about mass state intervention and state stimulus to create the green jobs that are not only going to be the jobs for generations to come, but are going to actually save our planet. This is what we now expect from a leader going forward. And I have to say this, Crispin, in respect of it. There was going on here now before our eyes, because nobody has talked about free ports and deregulations. What's going on before our eyes is that the Tories are presenting a vision of society that will see free ports created throughout our nations. And those will be zones for tax havens and tax dodgers. They will be deregulation zones. These Tories have realised that austerity did not work for them as much as it did not work for us. They've realised that you can plant the money tree, but it's just they want the money. And what they want to create now is a working class poor. Workers in work, but poor. In work poverty as the norm. And then they want to see an underclass that is left to its own vagaries, where the health system is privatised, and on a model that says very simply, the less health you provide, the more money you make. That is what's happening before our very eyes in society. And if we don't have a Labour leadership who are prepared to stand up to this and prepared to expose it and prepared to offer an alternative vision for society, well, exit the battlefield. Exit the battlefield now. And I'm telling you here now, Crispin, we are moving forward to a stage where the trade unions will be more vocal, where we will see people who want to stand up and present new leadership. And if the trade union leaders are not vocal in respect of this, then they will sit in the same place as Keir Starmer, and that is not going to happen. Keir Starmer needs to understand that if he thinks that the trade union movement will be silent in respect of his lack of opposition, then think again. There are those of us who are prepared to out it as failing. There are those that are prepared to say, you're speaking for the establishment as much as Tories. There are those of us who are prepared to say, I don't see the difference between you and a Tory. And there are those of us who are prepared to say that there is an alternative in society. And that alternative is called a movement, a trade union movement, a working movement, a solidarity movement, as Dave Kelly correctly referred to it, where we believe that we can change society, and we will start looking at the Labour Party as part of the problem and not part of the solution. And some of us, Crispin, on a day such as this, where we have seen such pathetic, mediocre responses in Parliament to the creation of working class poverty and the giving up of working class communities, some of us are prepared to say that a Labour leader has no place in our movement if he cannot find the spirit and the empathy and the solidarity to speak for us. And maybe his time is going to be up much sooner than I expected.
Wow. Lots of people applauding there. Howard, I have to say, you make things seem like we need to fight. We need to fight. We can't have this mediocrity. I want to show you a survey that I put out a survey to over 600 people, and these are the findings of the survey here. Where are we? That's the wrong one. Hold on a sec. Your speech has befuddled me. I'm doing the wrong thing. Right, here we go. Here we go. Look, this is a survey. It shows, is Labour failing to speak up for the most vulnerable during this crisis? This is that Labour supporters, 83% of Labour supporters thought that Labour is failing to speak up for the most vulnerable. And then this one here is probably the worst. Do you think Labour has a clear economic strategy? 87% say no. I mean, that's Labour supporters, you know. I mean, what do the country? I mean, what are the country thinking? If we can't even work out what Starmer's up to, then how is this going to win an election anyway?
Well, he's in danger, isn't he, of becoming a complete irrelevance? And that in politics is the worst that you can become, a total and utter irrelevance. And the reason why we find ourselves where we are with the Labour leadership is for two reasons, Crispin. First of all, that they've ignored 2017 and struck it out of the annals of history as if there wasn't a manifesto of change and hope that was embraced by young people of these nations and embraced by workers. That's been struck from the annals of history, because if they don't accept the result of 2017, don't talk about it, then Keir Starmer has to accept his own personal responsibility for the Brexit debacle that caused us to lose in such a way in 2019. And the second is because he believes that being a party of the establishment is the way to electoral success. Well, the mistake he has is that he has no vision. There is no answers from the right wing whatsoever. And that is why, Crispin, the people who rightly feel downhearted today, and I feel downhearted, but I feel more angry than I feel downhearted, people should understand that everything will return to the left, because at this moment in time, the right have no answers to the ailments of society. What we are seeing here right now is that greed is winning. And greed is winning because the Labour Party is being complicit in that you decide your electoral strategy whenever you become leader is to say nothing because you do not want to be attacked by the media. So you say nothing until you are 6 months from an election and then start dripping policies to the media and hope that they will accept you as a simple establishment figure that offers no real alternative. So we can accept if Boris Johnson is incompetent that we might move to you. This is a time of absolute crisis. People are dying in their tens of thousands. We are hearing of fire and hire systemically being used by greedy bosses around the country. We know that social care is a disaster, and it's a disaster because of profiteering. We know that the NHS has been privatised before our hands, and we know that there is this unreal movement of wealth from working people to the very few, stealing our futures, stealing the futures for our next generation. This is the moment whenever opposition in a democracy matters, because you step forward and you present an alternative. And what those graphs show, Crispin, is nobody is listening any longer because nobody believes that there is an alternative being offered by Keir Starmer, because if he had an alternative, how could you not say it? How could you not want to vocalise your alternative vision for society at this moment of crisis if you had one and you believed in it? And what the Labour Party is doing right now is leaving a vacuum. And the reason why I do want people to be confident in respect of this is because the Labour movement understands its role in society, the trade union movement understands its role in society, and that vacuum that is being left will be filled by the trade union movement. It will be filled, in the words of Dave Kelly, by solidarity.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Howard. So we've run on quite late, but I think it was worth listening to all the people who came on, and there were other people who didn't get to speak who I'd like to bring in because they wanted to speak about modern monetary theory and how, in a way, we're being misled about the budget at all from the start. Carol Wilcox, are you there? You wrote to say that we need to know more about modern monetary theory, and I mean I have to say that the way that we're presented with the budget is that we have to make cuts or we have to give take more tax. So what's the point of it? What does modern monetary theory say about this?
This is extremely important. Okay, it sounds a bit sort of technical, and I've got a degree in economics, and I never understood money at all until I heard about modern monetary theory, MMT. It's how the monetary system works in an economy like ours, where we've got our own currency. If you've got your own currency, you can't run out of money, basically. The only constraint is actually the real resources there. It's nothing, if money is nothing, it's just a token. It's meaningless. The government just, you know, and there's no such thing as taxpayer money. Your taxes do not fund public expenditure. It's a complete myth. With the government just creates money by keystrokes on a computer. That's it. There's no account where money comes in from taxes and then goes out to public expenditure. It's completely untrue. All that matters is the real resources, and people really need to understand that. Now, so that's how money is created, and it doesn't need, they don't need to borrow their own money. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's like, you know, a husband lending his wife money when they've got a joint account. It's absolutely meaningless. And you know, they don't have to sell government bonds at all. You know, that's actually corporate welfare. The you know, the finance sector love them. You know, they want them. There's a demand for them, but the government doesn't have to borrow its own money. It's absolutely ridiculous. Now, what's important about this is Labour. If our members could understand this, ordinary people understood this, that you've been tricked all these years, that you could say, you know, the government can actually provide everything we want, really. As I say, the only constraint are the real resources available, the land, the labour, the capital, the infrastructure that's provided. You know, all these things that, you know, the government just can put the money in, you know, buy whatever it wants in pounds. So, you know, this would, if people understood this, they would understand that there's no such thing as a deficit that has to be a hole in the finances that has to be, you know, eventually we have to put up taxes and everything for it. The taxes, we do have to have taxes. There's a reason for taxes, but it is not to actually pay for public expenditure. So, you know, we could have the hospitals, the NHS that we want, the care service we want. We could have free tuition at university. We could have all these things, and you know, but the government can choose. A government can choose austerity, and the Tories love it. Of course, that's what they want. But we should be under no delusion that we can afford it. We've got, you know, we're the 6th richest country in the world. We have got real resources. We've got wonderful workforce. You know, we've got loads of land. We could actually be self-sufficient in our own food here. So it's just one thing that I wanted to say, though, extra, that there is only one policy that modern monetary theory proposes, and that is the job guarantee. And it's intended really just as a transition into full employment, because full employment should be the objective, you know, of the government, because wages are the best way of pre-distribution of wealth, because labour creates all the wealth. So anyway, the job guarantee is an offer of a local job at a decent rate of pay. You know, when you look at all the jobs that have been destroyed and local authorities because they've been starved of cash, you know, the services we need, and it could easily be done with the job guarantee. Is that
all right? Well, thank you, because we've got Mervyn, who says he's got almost the same point to make as you, but I'll just see if Mervyn has anything else to say on the same thing. Mervyn.
Well, thanks for that. The first thing I'd like to say is that poverty is a government policy, and that the Tories actually use poverty to enrich the people they actually support, and that's the 1%. So poverty isn't by accident. It is a policy. It's a government policy. And that's what people really need to understand. And as has been said, money isn't a problem for our government. Our government creates 97% of all the money in circulation, and it creates it by typing numbers into a computer. So money is never a problem for our government. What's a problem is that people don't understand that. And what I think all Labour Party members need to understand is that when a government says it must raise tax, well, what they've got to ask themselves is, why do we need to raise tax when the government can create all this money? And the fact is that the government has to create the money so that you can earn it, so that you can then pay the tax that they're saying you need to pay in the first place. So that's just the issue as far as the technical issue, if you like, as far as how public expenditure works. But going back to 1977, what people don't understand is that the neoliberalism came around in the 1970s, and the neoliberalism is really a transfer of wealth and power from the poor to the wealthy. And what governments have done over the past 50 years really is set the framework whereby they can achieve that. And they use limited resources, that they actually make cuts to public expenditure to transfer all those public assets out of the nation into the hands of the private sector. And it's happening now where the NHS has just privatized the GP services to an American company. And that's where really the NHS is heading, is that American corporations are going to come in and take us over. And that's their objective. And what they have done is they've set the framework up so that they can actually achieve that. And they've used money, they've limited money in the public sector to do that. And that's covering everything from all the social benefits and everything else. They keep on shrinking that so that they force people into taking out insurances. If you can't have an insurance, then that's your tough luck, like they have in America. But what I really want to get across to people is that the government has an infinite supply of money. It isn't limited for them. They can pay for whatever is necessary. And that's the message we've got to get across to our members. And our members really do have to understand it. It's evil, in my view, that these people get away with it. But the Bank of England says, quite simply, that, and anybody can go online and actually do it, find out about this, and it's called money creation. And if you Google the Bank of England and money creation, you will actually be able to read how they tell you how the government prints money out of thin air. All of it, 97% of it.
Wow.
If I can just get that over.
It's really really interesting what you're saying, and also Carol, and we've got Mike Phipps who's come on the call. Let's see if I can click on Mike. There you are, Mike. Are you there?
How you doing?
I'm good. Have you followed? Are you saying similar to what's just been said by Mervyn and Carol?
Definitely not. But I think it's a bit of a rabbit hole to go down, to be honest. I'd rather get back to the budget. I think, putting it in very plain terms, there are some very simple tweaks that could have been done that could have made a budget like today's quite transformative. And let me just, we got Prem Sikka to write a piece on Labour Hub about this, and he's a professor of accounting at Essex University. And he just looks at it in plain budgetary terms. To give you just a few examples, earned income in this country is taxed higher than unearned income. So people who pay income tax pay it between 20 to 45% on their income. Unearned income, capital gains tax, runs between 10 and 28%. Why is unearned income taxed at a lower rate than earned income? VAT at 20%. Why isn't it graded so that there's a higher rate of VAT for luxury goods and much lower rates of VAT for ordinary sort of products that ordinary people have to buy. Corporation tax has been talked about, but you know, we're not putting up till 2023. Just a 1% increase in corporation tax would bring in an extra £3 billion a year. A windfall tax on companies that have benefited from the pandemic that has been referred to, like Amazon, like the click and collect companies and the supermarkets, as John McDonnell advocated, would bring in a huge amount of money. We could restore Labour's top rate of income tax for people earning over 150k that was abolished by the coalition in 2013. We could bring in a universal basic income for people who don't pay tax and who are still in poverty. We could actually do something about national insurance contributions, which is another regressive tax because people pay a bigger amount at the lower end of the scale than at the higher end. We could have graduated rates. We could update the council tax. The current situation is that the poorest tenth of people pay 8% of their income on council tax, whereas the richest tenth of people pay only 2 to 3% of their income on council tax. Most tax relief on pensions also helps the better off. We could bring in a financial transaction tax, the so-called Tobin tax. That could bring in, even if you introduced it at 0.1% on each transaction, you'd raise £8 billion a year. You could bring in a wealth tax on people earning over £500,000 a year. Bringing it in at 5%, that would bring in £260 billion. You could have a clamp down on tax evasion and tax avoidance. Even the Treasury's own figures say that last year they missed out on £31 billion of uncollected tax. Simple steps that could take a budget like today's, a completely wasted opportunity, and make it transformative and more egalitarian. So without going into lots and lots of theory, those are things that everyone could understand behind.
It's not theory.
Yeah, I didn't interrupt you.
Sorry. Sorry, I didn't mean to. You should have been muted, Mervyn. I should have made sure you were muted. I don't. This heckling is not acceptable, other than from me. So yeah, Mike, you've got great points there. I mean, it's what I found interesting about all the points just made is I didn't hear any of that from Keir Starmer in any way at all. So you know,
I don't know what's going on there. I mean, people have said to me, is it because he's got a different economic strategy going back to Keynes, so he doesn't want to sabotage the economy, or is it just about kind of drawing a line under Corbyn and cozying up to the establishment? I think it's about drawing a line under Corbyn. So anything that Corbyn might have advocated is already out the window. I think that's the problem. And, you know, there's a lot of rewriting going on. I'm just looking at a book I've been sent and everyone's saying, well, the 2019 was a nadir. But actually 2017 wasn't a bad result for Labour. We've got to get back to some of the values that we were able to articulate there. I'll put the link to what Prem Sicker had to say up in the chat anyway. So thanks.
Thank you. All right. Thanks, Mike. Thanks.
The people's flag is deepest red. It's shrouded off down martyr dead. There their limbs grew stiff and cold. Their hearts blood dyed its every fold. So raise the scarlet standard high. Beneath its shades we live and die. No cowards flinch, traitors sneer. We keep a red flag flying here. And it waved above our infant might when all ahead seemed dark as night. It witnessed me in deed and vow, which shall not change its colour now. So raise the scarlet standard high. Beneath the shade we live and die. Though cowards flinch, traitors sneer, we keep the red flag flying here. And it well recalls our triumphs past and gives us hope of peace at last. This banner bright, this symbol plain of human rights and humanity's gain. So raise the scarlet standard high. Beneath its shade we live and die. Though cowards flinch and traitors sneer, we keep the red flag flying here. So raise the scarlet standard high. Beneath its shade we live and die. Though cowards flinch and traitors sneer, we